The paper gown they gave me at the hospital was too thin for February, and I remember thinking that was the least of my problems. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he still was, legally on that Tuesday morning, had been in the room exactly 40 minutes before he checked his phone, said something about a work thing, and stepped out. That was at 7 a.m. My daughter Rosalind came into the world at 9:17. He missed it by 2 hours and 14 minutes. He came back eventually, kissed my forehead, said she was beautiful, took a photo for Instagram, posted it before I'd even held her for 10 minutes. I didn't say anything. I was too tired to say anything. After 31 hours of labor followed by an emergency C-section, I barely had the energy to keep my eyes open. My mother had flown in from Connecticut the night before and sat with me the whole time. She was the one who cut the cord. She was the one who held my hand when I cried. She was the one who said softly, into my hair, "Your father is on his way him." She gave me a look I recognized, the kind she'd been giving me for 2 years, ever since I'd introduced her to my husband at a 4th of July cookout in his parents' backyard in Naperville. The look that said, "You know better than this." I did know better. That was the part that kept me up at night, even before Rosalind. I had always known better. My name is Iris. I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, and if you know Greenwich, you know what that means. My father, Edmund Hartwell, built a commercial real estate company from one property management contract in 1987 into something that, by the time I was in high school, held assets in 11 states. He is not the kind of man who talks about money. He drives a sensible Volvo. He coaches Little League in the summer. He sends birthday cards on time. The only way you'd know what he was worth is if you looked it up, and my husband never did. That was, I think, the whole point of marrying him. His name was Spencer. He was handsome in the way of men who've been told they're handsome since birth. Easy smile, strong jaw, the kind of confidence that reads as charisma until you've lived with it long enough to see that underneath it is a very fragile need to be the most important person in every room. I was 30 when we met. I'd just come back from 2 years doing nonprofit work in Louisville, living in a studio apartment, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic. I was tired of people who looked at my last name and suddenly became very interested in me. Spencer had no idea who I was. To him, I was just a woman he met at a friend's dinner party who laughed at his jokes and didn't seem to want anything from him. It was refreshing, honestly. For about 18 months. We got married at the courthouse, small ceremony. My parents' blessing, but not their fanfare. Spencer met my family at Thanksgiving that first year. My father shook his hand. My mother made her famous apple cake. Nobody mentioned square footage or investment portfolios. We drove back to Chicago in Spencer's Jeep and he said, "I really like your parents. Super down-to-earth people." I smiled and said, "They are." I did not explain that the house we'd just had Thanksgiving in was worth $4 million and my father had paid cash for it in 1994. I told myself it didn't matter, that I wanted to be loved for me, that what my father had built was his, not mine, that a marriage should stand on its own. I was right about all of that. I was just wrong about the man. The first year was fine. The second year was harder. By the time I got pregnant with Rosalind, Spencer had started a small marketing consultancy with a college friend that was, his word, crushing it. And with that success came a new version of my husband I hadn't met before. He started noticing which restaurants had waiting lists. He started caring about the zip code of the neighborhood we lived in. He mentioned more than once that my job, I worked in grant management for a nonprofit arts foundation, didn't exactly scream ambition. "You could do something more," he said one night. We were doing dishes. Rosalind was 3 months away from existing. "More than what?" I asked. He said something vague about potential. About not playing small. I rinsed a pan and didn't answer, and somewhere behind my sternum something that had been loosening for a year quietly detached. His mother came to visit that October. His mother came, and she stayed for 5 days in our guest room, and during those 5 days she referred to my job as volunteering, asked me twice whether I was sure the neighborhood we lived in was safe, and told Spencer while I was standing in the kitchen and she apparently thought I couldn't hear, that she hoped I wasn't going to lose myself in motherhood since I didn't exactly have a career to go back to. Spencer didn't correct her. That was the thing I came back to, over and over, in the months that followed. Not what she said. People say things. What broke something in me was the silence from the man who was supposed to be on my side. Rosalind was born on a Tuesday in February. Spencer left the hospital on Thursday evening to have dinner with his business partner and some clients. His mother had arrived and was, according to Spencer, handling things, which meant she sat in the corner of the room giving me opinions about breastfeeding while I tried to keep a human being alive. He came back Friday morning. I was sitting up in bed, trying to eat something, and he seemed surprised to find me not fully recovered, as if a C-section were a minor inconvenience you slept off. You look tired, he said. I had surgery 4 days ago, I said. He nodded like I'd made an interesting point, and then told me that the doctor said I could probably go home Sunday, which was good because his mother needed the guest room after next week, and he was thinking Rosalind could sleep in the pack and play in our room, and we'd figure out the nursery as we went. I said okay. I was learning by then to conserve energy. Sunday came. A nurse helped me into a wheelchair, while an aide carried Rosalind in her car seat. Spencer was on the phone in the hallway. When the elevator doors opened at the ground floor, he was still talking. I pushed the wheelchair toward the exit myself. The nurse had been called away, and I told her I was fine, which was not entirely true but was easier than waiting, and made it to the sliding doors before Spencer caught up with me, phone still at his ear, hand up in a 1-minute gesture. His car wasn't out front. I looked around the roundabout. I looked at Spencer. He finished his call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and said, "Oh yeah, my brother needs the car today. There's a Chase ATM inside if you need cash for the bus. The 66 stops right out front." I stood there in February air, 4 days out of surgery, holding my daughter in her car seat, and I heard those words. The 66 stops right out front. I looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he started to seem slightly uncomfortable. Long enough that I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that this was not a misunderstanding. This was who he was. "All right," I said. He looked relieved. He actually looked relieved. He kissed me on the cheek and said he'd see me at home, and walked back through the sliding doors and disappeared. I stood on the sidewalk. Rosalind made a small sound, the way newborns do, not crying, just announcing that she was there, that she was present, that she needed someone to keep her warm. I pulled her blanket tighter. I breathed the cold air in, and then I called my father. It rang twice. He picked up on the second ring the way he always does, like he's been waiting. "Dad," I said. My voice did something I hadn't expected. Iris. Just my name. But the way he said it, I knew that he already understood there was something wrong. "I'm outside Northwestern Memorial. I just left and the baby is here and I don't have a..." I stopped. Took a breath. "Dad, can you send someone?" There was a pause of maybe 3 seconds. "Don't move," he said. "I'm calling now." 40 minutes later, a black Escalade pulled up to the hospital roundabout. My father's driver, a man named Phil who has worked for my family for 16 years, stepped out, took the car seat from me without a word, opened the rear door, and helped me in with a steadiness that made my throat close up completely. There was a blanket on the back seat, a bag with snacks, a card in my father's handwriting that said, "Come home, we'll figure the rest out." "Dad." I held Rosalind against my chest and cried the entire way to my parents' house in Winnetka, and I did not feel embarrassed about it, not even once. My mother was at the door when we arrived. She took the baby. She took my coat. She walked me upstairs to the room I grew up in, which still had the same quilt on the bed, and she sat next to me and didn't say a single word about Spencer, not one, just held my hand while I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how I had let it go this far. My father came in that evening. He sat in the chair by the window, the one he used to sit in when I was sick as a kid, and he looked at me for a long moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I will be." He nodded. "Do you want me to make some calls?" I knew what that meant. My father doesn't make scenes. He doesn't raise his voice. He makes calls. He moves carefully and thoroughly, and when he is finished, there is nothing left to argue about. "Not yet," I said. "I need a few days." He said, "Take what you need." Spencer called that evening, then the next morning. His texts escalated from confused to annoyed to something that tried to perform concern, but landed on entitled, "Iris, I think we need to talk about the decision you made. Taking the baby to your parents without discussing it feels like a big step. The decision I made." I stared at that message for a while. Then I put my phone face down on the nightstand and went to sleep. I stayed at my parents' house for 11 days. I healed. I learned Rosalind's rhythms, when she slept, when she didn't, what sounds she made when she was hungry versus when she just wanted to be held. My mother brought me food. My father came by every evening and sat in the chair. Neither of them pushed. Neither of them said anything about Spencer except once my mother saying, "Whatever you decide, we support you," and meaning it. Spencer showed up on day 7. He drove up the long driveway in his Jeep and rang the bell, and Phil opened the door and told him politely that Mrs. Hartwell would let him know when she was ready to speak with him. Spencer apparently stood there for a moment. Then he looked at the house, really looked at it, the way people do when they're suddenly seeing something they'd glanced past before, and said, to no one in particular, "This is your parents' house?" Phil said, "Yes, sir," and closed the door. I watched from the upstairs window. Spencer sat in his Jeep for a few minutes. Then he drove away. He called my father the next day. I don't know how he got the number. Mutual acquaintances, most likely, or some digging I don't want to think about too hard. My father told me about it that evening, in the chair, with the particular calm he uses when he is working very hard not to be angry. He called to explain himself, my father said. What did he say? That there had been a miscommunication about the hospital. I almost laughed. What did you say? My father looked at his hands for a moment. I told him that there were a few things I wanted him to understand. About my daughter. About what happens when someone I love is treated as an afterthought. He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. I had grown up watching my father handle things, and I knew the shape of it. I'll tell you what I found out later, piece by piece, through my own lawyer, and through conversations I didn't go looking for but that found me anyway. Spencer's consultancy, the one that was crushing it, had been operating on a line of credit extended by a silent investor my husband had never met in person. He didn't know the investor's name. He knew the investment firm, a mid-sized fund based in the Loop that had come to him through a referral. He'd been grateful and a little awed and hadn't asked many questions. The firm was called Hartwell Capital Management. It was a subsidiary of my father's company. I want to be clear. My father did not engineer this. He didn't go looking to put his thumb on Spencer's world. He runs a large portfolio and his people manage the pieces, and Spencer's small consultancy had simply caught the attention of one of those managers as a promising short-term play. It was in the vocabulary of people like my father, entirely unremarkable, a minor line item. But when my father made his calls, the ones he'd asked me permission for, the ones I'd asked him to hold off on for 11 days, one of those calls was to his portfolio managers, and they began a routine review of the consultancy's financials. What they found was not good. Spencer's business partner had been misrepresenting earnings. There were clients who'd been billed for services not rendered. There were contracts with language that wouldn't survive serious scrutiny. The review took 3 weeks, and at the end of it, Hartwell Capital quietly withdrew its credit line and flagged 2 of the billings for legal review. Spencer's consultancy folded in April. I didn't celebrate, I want to say that clearly. I was not sitting at my parents' house popping champagne over the ruin of a company my husband had spent 3 years building. I was nursing a baby and signing divorce papers, and trying to remember who I was before I'd spent 2 years making myself smaller so Spencer could feel larger. But I did feel something when I heard. Not satisfaction exactly. Something more like, of course. Like a sentence that had been running long finally finding its period. The divorce was handled by my father's attorneys, which meant it was handled with speed and documentation and a level of detail that left Spencer's lawyer very little room to maneuver. Spencer contested a few things. Then he stopped contesting them. I don't know exactly what changed his mind. I didn't ask. We settled in May. I kept Rosalind. I kept the apartment. We bought him out. I got full legal custody with reasonable visitation, which was what I wanted, because whatever Spencer was as a husband, I was not ready to say what he was as a father. That part I'd decided would be on him to prove. He has, for what it's worth, been showing up. Not perfectly, but showing up. I'm told people can surprise you. I'm trying to stay open to it. The night of my father's company gala. It's an annual thing, a fundraiser he hosts every year for a children's literacy nonprofit he's been running since my brother and I were kids. I almost didn't go. Rosalind was 4 months old, and I was still in that phase where leaving her for 4 hours felt like crossing a time zone. But my mother said, "You need one evening. We'll be here, go." So I went. The event was at the Langham. I wore a navy dress I'd bought before the pregnancy that fit again. Finally, and I pulled my hair back the way I used to before I'd spent a year dressed down and dimming. I felt, walking into that ballroom, something I hadn't felt in a while, like myself. Like the version of myself I'd set aside because I'd thought it would make someone else more comfortable. My father was near the entrance talking to a group of donors. And when he saw me, he excused himself and walked over and just looked at me for a moment. "There she is," he said. I hugged him. He smelled like cedar and the specific aftershave he's worn my whole life. "Thank you, Dad," I said. He pulled back and looked at me. "For what? For the car, for Phil, for not saying anything you didn't need to say." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Iris, you're my daughter." There is no version of that evening where I don't pick up the phone. I had to press my lips together to keep from crying in a ballroom full of people in formal wear. We went in together. The room was full of the kind of people my father has always surrounded himself with. Not the loudest people. Not the ones with the most conspicuous watches, but the ones who show up and mean it. A conductor from the symphony. 2 city council members who actually return calls. A woman who runs a network of after-school tutoring centers on the South Side. People who build things and don't need to announce it. I sat at my father's table. He introduced me to his colleagues not as my daughter, but by my name. And then, as the person who runs grant development at the Meridian Arts Foundation, which was the first time in 2 years I'd heard my work described correctly by anyone in a room with my last name in it. It was such a small thing. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. But it did. It meant everything. I want to tell you something about that hospital sidewalk in February. About standing in the cold with Rosalind in her car seat and watching my husband walk back through those sliding doors. People have asked me, since, if I was devastated, if I fell apart, if that was the moment everything broke. And the honest answer is, no. I think everything had been breaking for a long time. Slowly, quietly, the way old pipes do. You don't know until the morning you walk downstairs and find water on the floor. What I felt on that sidewalk was something closer to stillness. Like a snow globe after someone has shaken it and set it down, and finally, everything has settled. I knew what I had. I knew who was one phone call away. I wasn't starting over. I was remembering who I'd been before I'd spent 2 years pretending I wasn't. Rosalind is 8 months old now. She has my eyes, and, I'm told, my father's stubbornness, which I think is going to serve her very well. She has a beautiful room in an apartment that has good light. And on Sunday mornings, my parents drive up from Winnetka, and my father holds her while she tries, with great determination, to grab his glasses. She doesn't know what happened yet. She won't for a long time. But someday I'll tell her about the February morning I stood outside a hospital in the cold and called her grandfather, and how he picked up on the second ring, and how that was the moment I remembered. That being loved, really loved, the kind that doesn't make conditions, is not something you have to earn. It was already there. It had always been there. I had just forgotten to lean on it.